Welcome once again. I'm your instructor Vernon Creviston. This is our introductory video for Module 6 on the Foner textbook Chapter 20, From Business Culture to Great Depression. Now this particular module, or chapter really, of the textbook, might be one of my most favorite because this particular period is just so interesting. It's such a period of extremes here in the 1920s America. We go from having what's called the Roaring Twenties, this period of unbridled expansion of American economy, technological innovations really coming home, consumer goods being launched, just really what we would kind of consider to be modern America is kind of born in the 1920s. On the other extreme, for a lot of Americans, it's a very tough time. They're not doing well. A lot of American farmers aren't getting by. They're seeing their farms being destroyed or they're barely able to eke out a living. So while some people in America are living a great life, especially in the cities where all these new technological innovations are readily available, living a life like you would see in the books like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, or in the movie that was recently done with starring Leonardo DiCaprio, you see all these fabulous parties and all this conspicuous spending. Right? A lot of Americans are just flush with cash right now. Others, of course, are not. They're going to be struggling. They're going to come to resent kind of these changes. So in this particular chapter, this particular subject, this period of American history, we really see these extreme movements. But to kind of start off with the 1920s, let's start with a bang in a lot of ways. It's going to go out with a whimper, but it starts with a bang. And that bang is the Roaring Twenties of this birth of the consumer culture here in the United States. In the 1920s, you see the emergence of these national brands, things like Coca-Cola, GE Appliances, different car companies going national. So you could buy the same product anywhere in the United States. That's kind of a fantastic change for the United States. Used to be that things were kind of regional, right? You might buy Coca-Cola down in the South. You might buy some other soft drink up in the Northeast, something even different out in the West. Well, now you could actually buy a Coca-Cola product anywhere in the United States. It had become national. And because of that, manufacturing centers were springing up all over the United States, putting people to work, making these new goods, things like vacuums, refrigerators, washing machines. Everything starts to pop up for you to buy during this time. And because it's putting people to work, giving them money to spend, they spend it on these new products, putting even more people to work. The United States economy grows as a result of this expansion of a consumer culture, of all these new products being available to them. The United States goes from being the world's largest economy to an even bigger, largest economy, right? Just fabulous growth. Think about this. At one point during the 1920s, virtually every car made in the world was made in the United States. Almost half the goods sold in stores across the world were made in the United States. That is a tremendous growth in wealth for the United States. It's going to pay huge dividends in making this country bigger and stronger economically. But as I said earlier, there are some that aren't going to be partaking in this. They're kind of left out. And again, that's what the 1920s are about, these extremes, these pushing and pullings that are happening in the United States. But for the moment, let's kind of stick with what's good, right? What's happening, these big expansions. This consumer culture that appears in the 1920s, something that we could all kind of recognize in modern advertising today. So in the 1920s, you see the birth of this mass culture, a popular culture. Advertisers go out to sell all these new products, these new national brands through advertising campaigns, selling them much in the same way Wilson administration had sold World War I to Americans through the Committee of Public Information. Right, they go out and they create ad campaigns that sell these products based on emotion, sometimes making really outlandish claims that you really couldn't make, right? And there wasn't anybody there to check them and make sure that they were telling the truth back in the 1920s. So they would use anything and everything to sell these products, to make them more interesting, alluring to consumers, to kind of feed on this consumerism that's building up in the 1920s. And they do it in a variety of different ways. They do it through selling sex, like in hosiery ads, or they use celebrity endorsements. One of the most famous Americans at the time, a baseball player by the name of Babe Ruth, became ubiquitous. You could see him on almost any product in the United States, from candy bars to sodas to some liquor and tobacco products. You could really see him anywhere. Again, advertisers trying to connect their product to these popular individuals or these popular themes to increase their sales. So America becoming a lot more, identifiable, right? Much more relatable for us here in the 21st century. If we picked ourselves up, traveled back in time, say to the 1880s, 1890s, we could kind of understand that America, but it would be difficult for us to get around, to navigate our way around that particular world. But if we picked ourselves up and dropped ourselves off in 1920s America, while it would still be foreign, it would be difficult for us to kind of know exactly what was going on, what all the terminology meant. We really still could understand what was happening around us. We would be able to identify a lot of the things that we know in our lives today there in the 1920s. So in a lot of ways, the 1920s are the start of a real modern America, of an America that we would all understand and be able to operate in. And when you get down to it, the 1920s has a lot of new things that are available, a lot of things, again, that we come to rely on in our modern lives, right here in the 21st century. So what I want you to do is think about it. Out of these different industries that pop up, or these different items that pop up in the 1920s, what do you think is going to have the most impact on the United States at that time? Not in our time, but back in the 1920s. So it's going to be the development of automobiles, the development of movies and the movie industry, radio, or is it going to be music? Which one of those do you think is probably the most important, the one that's going to have the most impact on this decade, helping transform the United States once again? So keep that in mind. We'll go through and kind of look at each of these industries in turn here. So if you thought automobiles were the most transformative, or had the most impact in the 1920s, you're almost right. It is a close second to the one that actually does have the most impact. And the car culture that's going to come about, that is created in the 1920s, is going to have a big impact on the United States in a lot of different ways. One of the leading car manufacturers, Henry Ford, is going to raise his workers' pay to about $5 a day, which was about 30% higher than almost anybody else paid. And the reason was twofold for him. He wanted his workers to be as fast and efficient as possible, and he wanted to reward them for being fast and efficient. He paid them more and expected more out of them. He put together his assembly line process to make his cars as quickly and efficiently as possible so he could lower the price as much as possible. And thereby, by giving his workers even more pay, he hoped to make them also not just workers, but consumers of that product that they helped build. And that in turn would make them salespeople for that product and help spread it. Because if even the workers could afford the products they were making, that would make other people much more interested in buying that product. And it worked. Even though a lot of his competitors hated what Henry Ford was doing, hated how much he was paying his workers, they had to follow suit as they lost their best workers to him. They had to raise their pays. So again, you can kind of see 1920s is a very competitive period. These products are coming storming on the scene, changing American life, right? Changing the way Americans work and the things that they do and things that they can buy. And even look at this ad over here on the right side of the screen. As you can see, they're selling this product not just to men now, they're selling it to women as well. Once again, stressing that emotion, stressing those emotional ties that people have, trying to tell people that you have to have this product. You want to go out and have a good time, enjoy a family outing, you need a car. You need this item to help you do it, right? So this is the confluence of all these different elements happening here in the 1920s. And think also, what is the car going to mean for a lot of Americans? Again, I said it's a close second. It's almost the main item here. Henry Ford's going to sell millions and millions of his cars here in the United States and across the world. And a lot of other car manufacturers are going to make cars as well. As a matter of fact, Henry Ford's going to make approximately 20 million cars between 1920 and 1940. And considering that most of those made are going to be done in the 1920s, as little is going to be done in the 1930s because of the Depression, it just tells you just how many people are out buying these products, buying these new things that are available to them. But think the car is going to impact us in a lot of different ways, right? It's not just going to allow family outings. It's going to allow family vacations. It's going to give access to parts of the country that hadn't had it before. It's going to allow Americans to kind of go when and where they want to go, when they want to do it. They no longer have to wait for a train schedule. They no longer have to plan their activities to such a great degree, right? They can kind of be much more spontaneous than they ever have been before, much like we are today, right? So again, 1920s is starting to look like an America we can all understand and live in. Movies, of course, explode on the scene in the 1920s. Now, they have been around for a long time. Remember, Thomas Edison invents the movie projector back in the 1880s. And by the early 1900s, there are a lot of movie makers out there. But those movies were sometimes simple affairs. Well, they're always silent, so there wasn't any sound to it. But in the 1920s, a technological jump happens. Not only do you get to watch a movie now, now you can also listen to it. So there's some big changes, and because of these changes, Americans start flocking to the movie industry. So again, a very big, powerful transformation taking place in American pop culture. Americans go to the movies more and more and more. The U.S. is going to become the epicenter of this new entertainment device, right? The motion picture. It's going to actually move out to Southern California where it's really good weather all the time and still has access to transportation and everything else. Hollywood is born in the 1920s. And a lot of Americans spend their money going to these movies. They enjoy that form of entertainment. But even then, right, even as this new type of entertainment explodes on the scene, it still isn't as transformative. It isn't as ubiquitous. It isn't as deeply permeating as this other technological innovation of the 1920s. And that, of course, is the radio. Now, the reason why the radio has a deeper impact than the car or the movie theater is the fact that its cost is so much lower. Right? Almost anybody can afford it, even in rural locations. Movie houses are limited to the cities where they can get the most customers at the most time. A lot of towns, especially smaller towns in the United States, aren't going to have movie theaters until the late 1920s, 1930s, sometimes not even until the 1940s. So movies are kind of limited in where you can purchase them. Cars still really expensive, even with Henry Ford pushing down the price and paying his workers more. Not everybody can afford a car yet. Still very expensive. Still limited where you can use them. National transportation network still not up to speed. There still aren't a lot of paved roads in the United States. But the radio, this invention from the early 20th century, really comes into its own in the 1920s. Suddenly manufacturers are able to make them smaller, cheaper, to the point that almost anybody can afford them. And you can kind of see this in the numbers. In 1922, Americans bought about 400,000 radios in the United States. By 1929, there were more than 5 million. By the end of the 1920s, almost every single American family owned a radio. Most Americans still don't own a car. Only about 30% of Americans own a car by 1929. Only about half of Americans are going to see a movie by the end of the 1920s. But almost every American owns a radio or has access to one. And that's going to allow some massive changes. We're going to be able to have radio networks that are going to allow people across the country to be able to listen to the same exact thing at the same exact time. And that's going to allow them to share these experiences, things like presidential inaugurations, speeches, sporting events. Right? The World Series is held on radio for the first time. They give the game, play by play over the radio. You could listen to it anywhere for the first time in the 1920s. So now you didn't have to wait for the results in the paper the next day or go down to a telegraph office. You could listen to it at home as it happened. There's an amazing transformation happening, and Americans love it. And it's not just sporting events, right? You can get your news now daily through the radio. You can get entertainment programming, listen to plays, listen to bands play, right? A lot of different things happen over the radio. It's also the growth of different types of entertainment. Because radio comes along and it needs programming, it needs to put things out there. You had the birth of things like called the soap operas, right? Entertainment designed specifically for women who are at home doing housework during the days. Sponsored by a lot of the cleaning companies, groups like Procter & Gamble, big multinational corporations now. But they have their start back in the 1920s where they sell their products to women on shows designed for women. Also, radio is going to popularize new forms of music, things like jazz music. Started out in the 1890s throughout kind of the lower Mississippi region, Mississippi River Valley region of the United States, really born in New Orleans in the 1890s, in the African American communities. But as white musicians came in contact with it, they picked it up, kind of changed it a little bit to make it as acceptable as possible to white audiences, and started playing it throughout the United States. Again, transmitted over the radio, allowing everybody access to a type of music that many would never have come in contact with before. And especially, this is important for American kids. as they kind of use this new music as kind of their anthem, if you will, kind of a way for them to say that our time is different, that we're listening to something different than our parents used to listen to. And again, that's something that happens now, right? And it's born here in the 1920s. Before this, in the 1880s, 1890s, people listened to the same music all the time. You kind of grew up with certain songs, and your kids grew up with those same songs. But now in the 1920s, because of radio, you start having different programming for different people. Women have programming just for them, men for them. America's youth have their own programming. It's quite a variety of things, all created because the radio is made possible to more and more Americans, right? So the modern world, in a lot of ways, is born here in the 1920s. This particular magazine cover from a magazine called Judge Magazine in the 1920s, kind of a household magazine, if you will, sort of like a Harper's Weekly or a Life magazine, kind of depicts what we think of when we think of the 1920s, doesn't it? Kind of this party atmosphere, these good times are happening, where women are a little bit more outgoing than they had been before. Society's kind of released a lot of hold on them. This is the era of the flapper, right? These women that are able to kind of go out and do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want. Could go to nightclubs now, could smoke, could dress maybe a little more risque than they ever have been before. It's a less conservative time. Men are kind of seen as partying, having a good time as well, kind of enjoying themselves. That there's kind of a loosening of societal restrictions that had existed in the 1890s and early 1900s. That all, again, things that we kind of take for granted today kind of start there in the 1920s. But there is another side to all of this. The 1920s does have another aspect, and that's the fact that even though in that previous slide we saw somebody offering a drink to his presumed girlfriend, alcohol had actually been outlawed in the United States. The last thing the progressives were able to kind of do as a movement was in 1920 pass prohibition, making it illegal to own, to buy or sell alcohol in the United States. Now, you could still manufacture some small amounts of alcohol for your own personal consumption, but you couldn't purchase it. Bars weren't allowed to sell it. Beer manufacturers weren't allowed to manufacture beer anymore. They had to move on to other things or shut themselves down completely. Companies like Anheuser-Busch, one of the large beer manufacturers in the United States, actually switched to making root beer during this era of prohibition, kind of hoping that the laws would change and trying to hang on as best it could. This, of course, opened the door to people like this gentleman down here in the picture. Organized crime individuals like Al Capone, who stepped in to kind of fill this void created by the Prohibition Acts that made it illegal to sell alcohol. Well, they didn't care about the illegality of it. They went ahead and sold that alcohol anyways, pocketing the money. So the 1920s also sees the growth of organized crime, these large syndicates that allow individuals like Capone to amass great amounts of wealth, use that wealth to corrupt city, county, government officials of almost every level, and continue to do more illegal activities to try and evade the law as much as possible. So as much as Prohibition wanted to try and clean up and make the United States a more moral place to live in, it actually had the opposite effect. Prohibition is probably the one law that made most Americans a lawbreaker, because a lot of Americans ignored that particular amendment to the Constitution, went ahead and purchased alcohol, and they didn't care if they were buying it from an illegal source, from an organized crime individual like an Al Capone or others in the United States. So you can see the 1920s are kind of a schizophrenic decade. On one side, we want moral reform. On the other, we break that law constantly. We want to have a good time, but some people aren't having that good time. And that's what the 1920s are about. There's a lot of things out there to scare people in the 1920s. As we mentioned in the last chapter, at the end of World War I, because of the Russian Revolution, because of communists taking over Russia, there was this fear of a worldwide worker revolt, right? This communist revolution that people in Russia kept asking for, saying that they were going to bring to the world. Well, it seemed that was starting to happen here in the United States at the end of World War I in the late 1910s. As worker groups went on strike, led national strikes across the United States, or in places like Seattle where they had general strikes that shut down the city of Seattle, where troops had to be sent in to put down these riots, basically, where lots of people were killed or injured. So people are getting kind of worried. There's a lot of things to be afraid of. These communist influences infiltrating the United States, kind of making it unsafe. Uncertain is exactly what's going on. right? It scares a lot of Americans. Also, a lot of Americans start worrying about who's in the United States. Remember, back during World War I, one of the things that worried a lot of people before we got into the war was just what was going to happen to all these new Americans that had immigrated in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Were they going to stay loyal to the United States, or were they going to revert to loyalty to their home country where they came from? One of the reasons why the Wilson administration didn't want to get into World War I is because of that very issue. Well, here in the 1920s, people are still worried about these new immigrants to the United States, fearing the kind of their impact on the United States, see them as a danger. A particular group, the Ku Klux Klan, is actually reborn. Now, the Ku Klux Klan had disappeared back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It just wasn't needed anymore. It was so successful in disenfranchising African Americans in the South, of relegating them to a second-class citizenship, that it just wasn't needed. All of their aims had been met. So it had kind of quietly disappeared. You know, its legacy was still there in full force with the Jim Crow laws, but it actually had disappeared as an institution in the 1910s. But by the 1920s, it's back. Only now it's not just about being anti-African American. It still is that, don't get me wrong. They don't give up on that plank of their organization. But they also add all these other immigrant groups. They see Jews as a danger, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, right? Communists, everybody's a danger. And they start dedicating themselves, Klan members do, to defending white America from all these different influences. And as you can see, a lot of people start joining the KKK. It's not just a Southern institution anymore. These fears, these dangers that are out there for a lot of Americans are very real to them. So they react and they join this very kind of defensive organization, this organization that's going to go out and hold off all these dangerous elements, however it has to. So as you can see in this one postcard, people in Indiana, even women, are creating their own KKK chapters. You can see all different parts of the country have this organization popping up, kind of saying that they're going to protect white America from all these different elements. Ashland, Oregon has KKK parades. Tulare, California has KKK parades during the 1920s. Even the streets of Washington, D.C. have parades for the KKK, celebrating it, saying that it's a good institution, it's doing what it has to do. And notice the flag they're flying. They're no longer identifying themselves with the legacy of the Civil War, the Confederacy. Now they're identifying themselves as a national institution, an American institution, protecting white Americans from these dangerous elements, including African Americans, immigrants, communists, Jews, whatever it might be, right? And they're going to do whatever it takes to protect Americans from those particular elements. So once again, we see a lot of violence born in the United States. Not that it's really gone away, but it's kind of being rebranded, if you will. And the KKK is a new institution, kind of reborn from an old institution, to carry on that legacy, to make sure that these things happen. And America breaks down not just on these issues, right? But it breaks down in a lot of ways. Again, the 1920s are kind of a fracturing decade, right? Besides, it's a polarizing decade. There's these extremes. On one hand, you have this fantastic economic growth, and on the other hand, we're going to see a fantastic collapse at the end of the 1920s with the Great Depression. So it is kind of a decade of extremes. And another area where it gets extreme is kind of this idea of the modern world versus the traditional world. As I mentioned before, a lot of rural Americans kind of feel left out. Even with the radio, they kind of see a lot of these influences, a lot of this new music like jazz music as being kind of dangerous, kind of challenging the way they live their lives. And that was especially true in the American South. And in the American South, a lot of people kind of hold on to their old traditions. They consider themselves to be traditionalists. They don't want to see a lot of change. And one of the areas where they see the most strength, the most ability to kind of hold on, is in their religion, especially in the Christian Bible. They begin to interpret the Christian Bible literally. Now, that had never really been done before. For the most part, throughout Protestant history and even Catholic history, the Bible was seen as kind of a set of stories, allegories, ways to kind of live your life, right? Kind of suggestions from God, if you will, right? Ideas that you needed to kind of live your life a certain way or you would be punished. But now in the 1920s, Because of these changes that are happening in American society, especially rural Americans, looking at kind of what they consider to be kind of a decadent, corrupt urban America, start really holding tightly to their beliefs, don't want to be kind of challenged in their beliefs, don't like these ideas of what's coming out of modern universities that say the world is very old, that there are certain things that have happened in a certain order that aren't covered in the Bible. They dislike all that. So they go to a more literal interpretation of the Bible, saying that the Bible was, or that the earth was literally created in 7 days, that God created all the creatures of the earth at the same time and then allowed man to name them. Well, scientists were coming along challenging all these ideas, saying no, that man evolved out of a series of creatures into what he is today, that the earth had been around for billions of years, if not, at least hundreds of millions of years, not just a few thousand years, as traditionalists argued. So there was a big confrontation happening in the United States, and it centered itself there in Tennessee in the 1920s. Tennessee was one of the first states to say, we don't want to teach these ideas of evolution. We believe what we believe, and we don't want that challenged. Well, a high school biology teacher by the name of John Scopes challenges this, says, hey, we should be able to talk about these things, that maybe the Bible isn't right, and we should talk about that in a science classroom. Well, the parents of those students didn't like that idea, and they wanted John Scopes to be punished for teaching evolution when it was not allowed in his school. And he's put on trial. And this trial becomes a media sensation. The radio broadcast channels are there to record the events, to broadcast them across the United States, and Americans almost everywhere follow what goes on in this trial as both sides kind of hash it out. Now, interestingly enough, it's never really about John Scopes teaching evolution in the school. It's really about whether he should be able to teach evolution in the school. It's kind of a foregone conclusion that he broke the law. What's really kind of at the heart of this trial is whether it was okay for him to do this in the first place, right? Who's in charge of this school? Is it the parents who pay for it, or is it the teachers that have to educate the children, right? Should we give them the best education possible, or should we give them the education that their parents want them to have? That's really kind of what's happening here, and they're fighting it out. And you can kind of see America kind of is breaking down in a lot of ways. Rural Americans don't like this modern world that's coming out. Urban Americans kind of look at the rural environment, right? Rural Americans is kind of somehow backward, right? That they just haven't kept up with the times, that they're still stuck in the past. So you see another fracture happening in the United States. It's not just on cultural lines, it's not just on class lines, but it's also in kind of the way you live, where you live, breaks down in the 1920s. So the 1920s very much a decade, kind of something to kind of keep in mind. On the one hand, we have the rise of what we would consider to be a modern, identifiable America. Things like movies, radios, books become ubiquitous. Magazines are everywhere. Automobiles are now available, right? Advertising campaigns that we would recognize today start in the 1920s. Consumer products that most of us have in our homes, popularized in the 1920s. Electrification of the country grows in the 1920s. Electric power is now available more in the United States than it ever had been before. And with all of this comes a huge economic expansion. The United States goes from being the world's largest economy to the even greater largest economy. But there are these divisions. There are these kind of reactions to what's going on. There's this fear of outsiders, of people that are different than white Americans. You see the rebirth of the KKK, and it's spreading not just in the South, but throughout the country now. There's this breakdown between rural and urban Americans. Rural Americans are seen as backward. They become more tied to their traditions, more defensive of their traditions. The urban world, very modern, but also seen as very decadent. Again, kind of go back to the movie The Great Gatsby, the F. Scott Fitzgerald book, right? This idea that, yes, they're having a lot of fun. Yes, Americans in cities have a lot of things that they can do with their lives, but they end up kind of wasting it all, wasting their money, wasting their time, doing things that just don't benefit anybody. So that's kind of this breakdown that happens in the 1920s. And then, of course, there's the big ultimate breakdown. The whole system just collapses in 1929 during the great crash of the stock market. And that story we'll pick up in the next module with the next introductory video. But it is covered here in this chapter. So please kind of go through, read the chapter, and do the exercises as they're laid out in the module online in Blackboard. Thank you very much.